The night my husband died, I held our newborn daughter against my chest and drove 3 hours through freezing rain to my parents' house, begging for just one room until I got back on my feet. My mother looked at the baby, then at me, like I was a stranger asking for a favor she had no obligation to give. "This isn't a shelter," she said. Then she shut the door while my daughter cried in the cold November air. 6 years later, that same woman would be standing outside a door of her own, needing something from me far more valuable than a room. And I was the one who got to decide whether to open it. My name is Vivienne Pemberton, and before I tell you what happened 6 years later, I need you to understand what it felt like to be 26 years old, widowed, and holding a 7-day-old baby with absolutely nowhere left to turn. Julian and I had been married 2 years when our daughter, Josephine, was born. We lived with his parents, Marguerite and Desmond Hart, in their colonial house on the edge of Belhaven, Vermont, because Julian was finishing his engineering degree and money was tight. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he graduated and we could afford our own place. I told myself that arrangement 6 months in, and I told myself that same thing the night everything fell apart. I want to be fair about those 2 years, because they weren't all difficult. Julian used to fall asleep with textbooks open on his chest, and I'd find him in the mornings still wearing his reading glasses. He talked about our future apartment the way other people talk about vacations, describing rooms that didn't exist yet in a level of detail that used to make me laugh. When I found out I was pregnant, he cried in the parking lot of the pharmacy before we'd even made it back to the car, and for a few months, even living under his mother's roof felt bearable, because I believed we were building towards something that would eventually be entirely our own. Julian lost his life in a traffic accident on his way home from the hospital, the same night Josephine was born. He never got to hold her. I found out over the phone in a hospital bed, still recovering from childbirth, a nurse pressing tissues into my hand while I tried to understand how a person keeps breathing after news like that. I remember staring at Josephine in the bassinet beside me, this tiny, unaware person who had just lost her father before she'd ever had the chance to meet him, and thinking that grief has a way of making even the smallest tasks, holding a bottle, signing discharge paperwork, feel impossible. I want to tell you Julian's parents held me up during that grief. They didn't. Marguerite had never fully accepted me, always making quiet comments about how Julian could have done better, and with him gone, whatever thin patience she'd had for me evaporated completely. I remember one dinner, maybe 4 months into the pregnancy, where Marguerite mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she hoped the baby would take after the Hart side in temperament, a comment Julian brushed off as harmless but one that sat with me for weeks afterward. Looking back, it was one of many small signals I chose to overlook because acknowledging them fully would have meant admitting how precarious my place in that house really was. For days after the funeral, while I was still learning how to function on almost no sleep with a newborn, Marguerite sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me it was time to make other arrangements. The house, she said, was never meant to hold 3 generations. Without Julian, there was no reason for me to stay. I asked for time. A month, maybe 6 weeks, enough to find a job and a place I could actually afford on my own. She told me I had until the end of the week. Desmond, at least, had the decency to look uncomfortable about it, though he never once said a word in my defense. I packed what I could fit into 2 suitcases and a diaper bag, and I remember standing in the doorway of the nursery Julian had painted the month before Josephine was born, a soft, unfinished shade of yellow, thinking that I would never get to finish it with him. I called everyone I could think of. Most of my friendships had quietly become Julian's friendships over 2 years of marriage, and in the strange, uncomfortable math of grief, most of them sided with distance. There was only one option left, one I'd avoided for years because of how complicated it was. My own parents, Anson and Rosalind Pemberton, who lived 3 hours north. My mother and I hadn't been close since I left for nursing school at 18. She'd made it clear back then that she thought I was chasing a life she didn't approve of, one that pulled me away from the family business and the plans she'd had for me. We spoke maybe twice a year, always briefly, always a little formal. But she was still my mother. And a mother, I told myself, driving through freezing rain with a crying newborn strapped into the back seat, would not turn away her own daughter and grandchild with nowhere else to go. I rehearsed what I would say the entire drive. I planned to explain that it would only be a few weeks, that I had savings from Julian's small life insurance stipend through work that would cover groceries and gas, that I wasn't asking for charity, just shelter while I figured out the rest. I told myself if I explained it calmly enough, clearly enough, my mother would see reason. I believed, foolishly, that preparation could soften a decision that had already been made in her mind long before I arrived. I was wrong. I arrived at my parents' house close to midnight, exhausted, half frozen, carrying Josephine wrapped in every blanket I owned. My mother opened the door in her robe, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something soften in her face when she looked at the baby. Then it hardened again, faster than I could hold on to. "This isn't a shelter," she said. My father stood behind her in the hallway light, silent, which somehow felt worse than if he'd spoken. I begged. I told her it would only be temporary, that I had nowhere else, that Josephine needed somewhere warm. My mother's answer was to remind me that I'd made my choices when I left home at 18, and that those choices came with consequences she wasn't responsible for softening. I asked if I could at least come inside long enough to warm the bottle I'd prepared for Josephine, just 15 minutes out of the cold, and she told me the porch light would stay on long enough for me to find my way back to the car. Then she closed the door, and I stood on that porch with my daughter crying against the wind, and I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I decided I would survive without either family. And I decided I would remember every detail of that night, the exact color of the porch light, the exact sound the door made when it latched, the exact number of seconds I stood there before my legs finally agreed to walk back to the car. I drove to a 24-hour diner and sat in the parking lot feeding Josephine from a bottle, crying so hard I could barely see the steering wheel. A waitress named Coraline noticed me through the window and came out with a blanket and a coffee she refused to let me pay for. She sat with me for nearly 20 minutes on the curb, not asking questions I wasn't ready to answer, just staying present while I got my breathing back under control. She told me about a women's transitional housing program 2 towns over. I called the number from the diner's payphone before sunrise, and by morning I had a bed in a shared room and a caseworker named Fenimore Blackwood helping me build a plan from nothing. Fenimore was the first person in weeks who spoke to me like my situation was solvable rather than shameful. She helped me apply for emergency assistance, connected me with a food program, and sat with me while I filled out job applications with a baby asleep in a carrier against my chest. I remember her telling me something I still repeat to myself on hard days, that surviving a crisis and building a life are 2 different skills, and I was allowed to take my time learning the second one. The next 2 years were brutal in ways I still don't fully talk about. I worked double shifts at a medical billing company during the day and studied for a healthcare data certification at night, because during my time around hospitals, I'd noticed that the people who managed the systems, not just the patients, were the ones with actual long-term stability. Josephine spent her toddler years rotating through daycare centers, church nurseries, and evenings with Odalise Ferreira, a friend from nursing school who became more of a sister to me than either family ever had. Odalise used to joke that we were building an entire support system out of second-hand furniture and stubbornness, and honestly, that wasn't far from the truth. There was one winter, when Josephine was almost 2, where our car's heater failed and I couldn't afford the repair for nearly a month. I used to warm blankets on the stove before we left each morning and wrap her in them for the drive to daycare, watching the clock the entire time to make sure we made it before they went cold. I tell you that detail not for sympathy, but because it's the kind of quiet, unglamorous struggle nobody sees from the outside, the kind that makes you fiercely protective of any stability you eventually manage to build. Odalise used to come by on weekends with groceries she called extras from a sale, though I later found out there had been no sale at all, just her stretching her own tight budget to make sure Josephine and I had enough. I never asked her to stop, and I never fully thanked her the way I should have, because in those years, accepting help without apologizing for needing it was its own kind of exhausting. It's strange, looking back, how a stranger's daughter of a friend from nursing school became more reliable family than the people who shared my blood. I still remember the interview for that first full-time healthcare data position, sitting in a borrowed blazer in the firm's lobby, rehearsing answers to questions about gaps in my resume that I'd prepared to explain honestly, without asking for pity. The hiring manager, a woman named Delphine Okafor, later told me she'd hired me not despite that honesty but because of it, saying she'd rather build a team around people who'd proven they could handle real pressure than people who'd simply never been tested. That job became the foundation everything else was built on. By the time Josephine turned 3, I'd landed a full-time position with a healthcare data firm in Burlington. By 5, I'd been promoted twice and moved us into a real apartment with a yard and a bedroom that was entirely hers. It wasn't easy. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor after she fell asleep, crying quietly so she wouldn't hear, wondering how two people who were supposed to be her grandmother and grandfather could look at an infant and see an inconvenience instead of family. Josephine started kindergarten the same year I got my second promotion, and I remember sitting through her class's family tree project, watching her draw careful little boxes for Mommy and Daddy in heaven, leaving 2 boxes blank at the top because she didn't have names to put there. Her teacher asked gently if there were grandparents to include. I told her, just as gently, that there weren't, not yet, and I remember driving home that afternoon wondering if that blank space on a kindergarten worksheet would end up being the most honest description of my parents I'd ever give my daughter. But something else happened during those 6 years, something I didn't expect. Belhaven is a small town, and small towns talk. Through Odalise, whose cousin still worked at the daycare Julian's sister Priscilla used, I heard fragments over the years about the Hart family. Desmond's construction business had run into serious trouble, over-leveraged during a commercial expansion right before the regional housing market turned. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't triumph. It was distance. That family had already become background noise to me. Priscilla did reach out once, about 3 years in, an unexpected message saying she was sorry for how things had unfolded and that she'd argued with her mother about it at the time without success. I appreciated the gesture, and we've exchanged the occasional message since, mostly about Josephine's milestones, but I never let that family back into the center of my life. Some doors I chose to leave only slightly open. The one that mattered most, the one I couldn't stop thinking about, belonged to my own parents. My own parents were a different story. About a year ago, I received a call from my father, Anson. His voice was thinner than I remembered. He told me their small manufacturing supply business, the one my mother had always assumed I'd take over one day, had lost its biggest contract 18 months earlier and never recovered. Around the same time, he'd had a cardiac scare that kept him hospitalized for a week. My mother, he said, hadn't been the same since, quieter, more withdrawn, spending most evenings going through old paperwork as though searching for a decision she could still undo. And then, carefully, almost like he was afraid of the answer, he asked if there was any chance I could help. I sat with that phone call for a long time after we hung up. Josephine was 5 by then, old enough to ask questions about family she'd never met, and I remember looking at her drawing at the kitchen table, completely unaware that the 2 people she asked about occasionally were the same 2 people who once stood in a doorway and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Around that same period, I'd also finally received clarity on something Julian left behind, a life insurance policy through his engineering firm's employee benefits program. The policy had always existed. The delay was caused by an administrative error during claim processing, tied to an outdated mailing address on file from when Julian was first hired. An attorney named Graham Whitfield took on the case after a mutual contact at my firm referred me, and he walked me through 8 months of document requests, verification calls, and one especially tense meeting with the insurance company's internal review board, who initially argued the claim had exceeded a filing window that, as it turned out, had never actually applied to a documented processing error on their end. Graham didn't back down, and eventually, neither did I. The settlement that finally arrived gave Josephine and me real financial stability, the kind I'd been building toward with nothing but overtime and stubbornness for 6 years. So when my father called asking for help, I wasn't answering from a place of scarcity anymore. I was answering from a place of choice, which made the decision so much harder, not easier. Part of me wanted to remind him, word for word, what my mother had said on that porch while my daughter cried in the freezing air. Part of me wanted to feel something like justice in saying no. But mostly, I felt the strange, uneven weight of finally having exactly what they needed, and remembering exactly what they refused to give me when I needed it most. I didn't say yes right away. I also didn't hang up. For nearly 2 weeks after that call, I went back and forth on what fairness even meant in a situation like this. Josephine deserved grandparents if there was any real chance of that relationship being genuine. But I also refused to let genuine become a word my parents got to define on their own terms again, the way they had that November night. I finally decided the only way to know which version of my mother I was actually dealing with was to see her in person, not over a phone line where it's easy to sound sorry without proving it. Instead, I asked to see my mother in person, for the first time in 6 years. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by more than just financial stress. We sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen I used to help set the table in as a child, and for a long time neither of us said anything about that November night. The silence stretched long enough that I almost stood up and left. Finally, I asked her the only question I actually wanted answered. Why? Her answer wasn't the excuse I expected. She told me she'd been terrified that night, not of me, but of what taking on a widowed daughter and infant grandchild would mean for a marriage and household already strained by financial pressure she hadn't told anyone about, not even my father at the time. She said the business had already been struggling quietly for over a year, and the idea of adding 2 more people to feed, house, and worry about had felt, in that exact moment, like more than she could survive. She admitted, quietly, that fear had made her cruel in a moment that should have called for the opposite, that she'd told herself it was practical when really it was just frightened, and that there was a difference she hadn't been willing to face for a long time. I told her I understood fear. What I didn't understand was silence, 6 years of it, not one phone call, not one letter, not one attempt to check whether her granddaughter was even alive. She had no answer for that part, and I didn't push her for one. Some silences don't have justifications, only consequences. I told her I thought about that porch every single day for 6 years. Here's what I decided to do. I didn't hand my parents a check to erase their financial trouble, and I want to be honest that a part of me considered it, briefly, in a weak moment where I imagined it might buy back 6 lost years all at once. But money has never been able to purchase the thing that was actually missing, which was simply their presence, offered without being asked for it. What I did instead was set up a modest trust fund through Graham Whitfield's office, specifically for Josephine's future education, funded partially by Julian's settlement. Graham helped me structure it so that neither of my parents could access the funds directly, only contribute to them if they chose, ensuring the money would always exist for Josephine regardless of how the relationship with her grandparents developed. I told my parents, in a conversation that took place over 2 separate phone calls because I couldn't get through it in one, that if they wanted a relationship with their granddaughter, and eventually with me, that door was open, but it would be built slowly, on consistent presence rather than financial convenience, starting now, 6 years later than it should have. My mother was quiet on the phone when I laid it out. Then she said something I didn't expect. I don't think I get to ask you for anything after what I did. But I'm asking anyway, because I'd rather have a little of my daughter back than none at all. I told her that showing up once wasn't going to undo 6 years, and it wasn't going to undo that porch. If she wanted any kind of relationship with Josephine, it would have to be earned in small, consistent pieces, not declared in a single phone call. So that's what happened, slowly, over the better part of a year. My mother started with something simple, a weekly Sunday call to Josephine, nothing more. For the first 2 months, I sat close by during those calls, listening, gauging whether the effort was real or performative. It didn't waver. By month 3, she asked if she could attend one of Josephine's dance recitals, and she showed up an hour early with a bouquet, sitting quietly in the back row so as not to make a scene. By month 6, she was making the 3-hour drive down every other weekend, always calling ahead, always respecting the boundaries I'd set, never once bringing up money or asking for anything beyond time with her granddaughter. There was one moment, around month 5, that told me more than any of the earlier gestures combined. Josephine came down with a bad flu the week my mother had planned a visit, and instead of rescheduling for her own convenience or making the moment about her disappointment, my mother drove down anyway, sat outside Josephine's closed bedroom door for an hour just so she'd know someone was there, and left a stack of favorite books on the nightstand without asking to come inside. It was a small, unremarkable act by most standards. To me, it was the clearest evidence yet that something in her had actually shifted, not just around the idea of family, but around what showing up is supposed to look like when it isn't convenient. My father's health held steady as their business settled into a smaller, more sustainable model, built without a rescue from me. He came along on some of those visits too, teaching Josephine how to whittle small wooden birds on the back porch, something he'd apparently done with me once, decades ago, before I'd stopped remembering it. By the time a full year had passed, Josephine had started asking for her grandmother by name before Sunday calls even started, a small, ordinary sign that something real had been built, one visit at a time, with no shortcuts. I still keep some distance for myself. Some things take longer to rebuild than others. But I watch my daughter reach for a relationship I once thought would never exist, and I remind myself that showing up, consistently, is the only currency that ever really counts. These days, Josephine is 7, and her family tree project this year had 2 new boxes filled in at the top, not with the confident permanence of a relationship that's always existed, but with the careful, still-forming handwriting of one that's still proving itself. I keep that worksheet on my refrigerator, not because everything is resolved, but because it's proof that things can change when someone finally decides to do the work instead of just wishing the past had gone differently. I won't pretend the porch that November night disappeared from either of our memories. It didn't, and it shouldn't. But I've learned something in the years since. Holding on to bitterness as a full-time job costs more than it gives back, and so does refusing to let people prove, through actual effort, that they've changed. I built a life so stable, so undeniably mine, that I never again had to stand outside anyone's door begging to be let in from the cold. And slowly, my daughter is building something with the people who once refused me, on terms that are entirely her own, and at a pace I still control. That's the real inheritance I gave her. Not the money. The proof that we would always have somewhere warm to go, and the standard that anyone who wants back in has to earn it, one Sunday at a time. Sometimes the people who shut the door on you are the ones who end up needing you to open one for them. What you do with that moment says more about who you are than what they did to you. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to Sophie Revenge, because we post a brand new story just like this one every single day.